Hello, how are you doing? I hope your reading year is going well so far. Somehow we are already halfway through 2022. Time seems to be going by really fast, but that means some book lists are coming out of some best books of the year so far, and one list that caught my eye was by BBC Culture, a list compiled by Rebecca Lawrence and Lindsay Baker, where they picked 14 books that they cite as the best books of the year so far. And some interesting choices, mostly novels, but there's a couple of nonfiction books and a poetry collection, which is great to see. And I've only read a few of these books, and a couple of them I really agree with. One of them I really don't agree with, and a number of the other books I think sound really interesting and good. And actually I just went on a shopping spree to Daunt Bookshop, the one near Baker Street, and bought a number of these books because I think they sound really good. So I thought I'd go through each book individually and talk a little bit about it and any thoughts or feelings I have about these titles. First is a debut novel which came out here in the UK at the very beginning of the year, called How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu. And I read this book at the very beginning of the year. It was a great way to start the reading year, and it was written before the pandemic, but the subject of the story would make you think otherwise, because it's all about a deadly disease which spreads across the earth and wipes out a lot of the population, but it's told through segments, through different characters' points of view, and some of these characters connect up with each other. But it's really kind of like a collection of short stories, because you really get these vignettes, some which are in a tone which is more kind of sci-fi, and then others are a bit more like traditional literary fiction. But the way the stories build up against each other, and you kind of see little snippets of what happens to humankind over the course of many years and where it progresses into the future, is so fascinating, and I was just completely gripped by this story. Next is a non-fiction book, which is Burning Questions by Margaret Atwood, with this fantastic image of the author on the cover. And this is her essays and writings from the years 2004 to 2021. And so there are essays in here which are reflections on her own writing and the process of writing, and there's one essay about why I wrote Mad Adam, and an essay about writing the Testaments and, you know, returning to The Handmaid's Tale. Other essays are about just the writing life in general and literature in general. Others address broader political questions. Others are reviews of specific books, like Richard Powers' novel The Echo Maker, and Hilary Mantel's Bring Up the Bodies, and some profiles on particular writers. So yeah, all about the writing and political life. And I mean, she's such a fascinating intellectual and public figure. So it'll be so wonderful just sort of having this on my bedside and reading an essay now and then, just to get an insight into her mind. And if you've ever heard her speak, she has this wonderfully droll tone of voice, like very monotone, which is actually like quite funny. And so like while I'm reading these, I'm sure I'm gonna have her voice in my head. Then there is a poetry collection, Bless the Daughter Raised by a Voice in Her Head, which is a fantastic title by Warsan Shire, who's a Somali-British writer. And this is her very first poetry collection, though she's published a couple of chapbooks in the past, and she's most famous for contributing to Beyonce's visual album Lemonade, which was such a fantastic piece. And it has a really striking cover, and also the inside has this repeated pattern of hair picks, which is so fantastic. And it's following the development of a young woman and how she came to embody, you know, her own particular voice. And there's sort of reflections on that process of loneliness, but also her attitude and connection with different pop culture references. So there's a poem near the beginning called Drowning in Dawson's Creek. And then there's a poem towards the end, which is called Bless Grace Jones, which is so fantastic. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to diving into some of these poems. It's quite a slender collection, just under 80 pages long. Another nonfiction collection, In the Margins by Elena Ferrante, and it's subtitled On the Pleasures of Reading and Writing. And this is a really rare insight into this author's process and thoughts about the writing life, because she's famously a reclusive author that doesn't do public events. People know very little about her personal life, and so yeah, this is a rare insight into her process and thoughts about what it means to be a writer and how she goes about writing. So this will be really interesting to dive into. Next is a great big fantasy epic, Marlon James' Moon Witch Spider King, which is the second book in his Dark Star trilogy. I absolutely loved the first novel, Black Leopard, Red Wolf, and I started reading this, but got a bit distracted because it is a fantasy novel and that is rich in violence and sex, so you really need to be in the right mood and frame of mind, I think, to read this book. And when I started reading it, I just wasn't quite ready for it, so I do want to return to it at some point, because I thought it was interesting showing how it showed the origin stories of this kind of mythical witch. You see her from the very beginning and her struggles to survive and achieve a sense of independence, and then she goes on to defend women that are marginalized and used and abused. And and I saw, you see a bit of her in the first book, but this is told from her point of view, so I think she'll give a very different version of events than what we got in that first novel. So yeah, it'll be really fascinating to go back to. Olga Dies Dreaming by Xochitl Gonzalez, and this is a novel set in New York City around a time when a devastating hurricane hit Puerto Rico. So it's about a number of characters' responses to that, and it's about family strife and political corruption and notions of the American dream. It sounds like a really rich story, and I've heard really great things about this book. Glory by NoViolet Bulawayo, and I'm so happy that I finally bought a copy of this novel, which I've been really looking forward to because I loved her debut novel called We Need New Names, which came out quite a few years ago. So this is her much anticipated follow-up book to that, and the cover is gorgeous, isn't it? And also the insides, the patterns of the insides, and it really reflects this story, which is set in an animal kingdom and is about political strife within that kingdom, but it's really satirizing the coup which toppled President Mugabe in Zimbabwe in 2017. It's been kind of dubbed a Zimbabwean Animal Farm because it's playing on that tradition of George Orwell, although it's noted in the article that by aiming the lawn-piercing gaze of this metaphor at the after effects of European imperialism in Africa, Bulawayo is really out-Orwelling Orwell, which is a really great way to put it. And I'm always slightly suspicious of when writers outside of like a Western tradition, when their books are kind of compared to Western writers. But if you think about it, and it kind of makes sense because the author, she was born and grew up in Zimbabwe until she was 18 when she moved to America. So obviously feels this, sense of mixed, influences and heritage, and so I think it like makes sense to make those comparisons, and I'm just so looking forward to reading this story. Then there is Anne Tyler's new novel French Braid, which I love Anne Tyler's work, and I've had some great personal recommendations for this novel, which is a multi-generational saga over across 6 decades, from the late 1950s up until almost the present time, following a family and how certain events from the past kind of reverberate through the generations. And I think it follows a number of different family members' perspectives over the decades, so you get little pieces about this family life, but then also reflections on the past and how that affects their present. And Anne Tyler is so good at showing the dynamics of family life, how families can be such a supportive, like wonderful aspect of our lives, but also how we can crave independence from them and a sense of autonomy separate from them. And I just love how she captures that in her fiction. Her novel Breathing Lessons is so amazing, and her novel Ladder of Years is one of my favorite novels of all time. So it was a few years ago when Anne Tyler said that she had written her last novel, but she's published a few books since then. So luckily that wasn't her last book. And you can see on the inside here just how many books she's published over time. And she seems to have become even more prolific in recent years. Strangely, after making this declaration, she wasn't going to be writing anymore. And this copy I got, it's there's a sticker on it that says Independent Bookshop Exclusive Edition. I don't really know how this edition of the book differs from other copies of the novel, but anyway, it's a fun thing to have. To Paradise by Hanya Yanagihara, her much anticipated follow-up, and this was another book that I read at the very beginning of the year and was a great way to start a year, even though it's a very long book, and so quite a time-consuming experience. And you know what? I still don't really know how I feel about this book entirely. It is so fascinating, and I was really gripped and involved through the different stories in this book, but then I do still question, like, should this be one novel? Shouldn't it be 3 separate novels? And do the different sections really work in connection to each other, even though each of them is so interesting and involving in its own right? So yeah, I still don't really know how I feel about it, but I was very glad to read it, and I'm enjoying watching the continuing discourse about this book. Here's a novel I'd not heard of before this list, which is why I like looking at these book lists so much, because they can kind of tip me off to books that I might have missed. And it's called The School for Good Mothers by Jessamine Chan, and it's a novel set in the near future where a mother temporarily leaves her child at home alone, just for a few hours, but it's discovered that she's left her child there, and so the child is taken into protective services, and the mother is told that in order to get back her child, she needs to go through a training program during which she has to care for a robotic child, and which has some like spying equipment on it to monitor how she is caring for it, which is a terrifying situation, but it sounds like such a fascinating story. And yeah, I think this the author's American. It was first published in America, and maybe it's one of those books that just hasn't made much of an impact on the UK yet, or at least I haven't heard about it all that much. But I really like to get a copy of this. The Exhibitionist by Charlotte Mendelson. And I'm sorry to say, this novel really didn't work for me. I didn't enjoy it at all, and it really frustrated me. It's the story of this domineering artist who's absolutely horrible to everyone, basically, to his long-suffering wife and his adult children, and so it moves between their different perspectives and the issues issues they're going through. The events are sort of building up to this patriarch. He was a famous artist at one point, and his fame has kind of continued, but he's not had any great successful exhibitions in a long time, and so he's giving this new exhibition, and his family members around him. His wife is also an artist, and she gets this great opportunity, which she's hesitant to take because she knows it will displease him, and she doesn't want to tread upon his ego or make him upset. And yeah, just I got so frustrated with it, and I know that people like this exist, and but I just felt I didn't get any real insights into why his family members were sticking around him when he has been so egregious and horrible to them. And I know my friend Anna James tried to convince me of why she thought it was a sympathetic depiction of this situation, but I just didn't feel it was so. I didn't really get any insights from it. I got really frustrated with the characters when, even though I know I should have been sympathetic to their suffering, but yeah, even those characters, I really didn't like reading about them, and just thought that they were really flat and yeah, not really three-dimensional or interesting in the way that I like to read about characters. So I would not recommend this book. Free Love by Tessa Hadley. I wasn't sure if I wanted to get a copy of this novel because I had heard some mixed reviews of it, but then I have had some really strong personal recommendations that I should read it, and The Guardian a number of years ago declared that Tessa Hadley is one of this country's greatest contemporary novelists, and I've actually never read anything by her before, so I think this would probably be a good place to start. So it's a novel about a family. It begins in the late 1960s, and though they are a family that seem set in their roles and places within society, they gradually start to break out of those prescribed roles, and it follows how their personal changes are kind of in sync with larger political and social changes that are occurring around them. So it sounds like a really fascinating story. Black Cake by Charmaine Wilkerson, and this is a novel I think I'm really going to enjoy. Just the subject of it sounds really like my kind of thing. It's about two estranged siblings that come back together when their mother has died, and their late mother has bequeathed to them two things. One, a sound recording of her describing a family secret of theirs that they had no awareness of before, and which really changes their idea about their family history between the Caribbean and America. And secondly, a family recipe for a traditional Caribbean black cake, and how the mother wants them to bake this cake and share it when the time is right. And I just love stories that involve foods and family recipes, and so that's something that just really appeals to me. But also the story of family secrets I think sounds really intriguing. So yeah, really looking forward to reading this. And finally, there's a book which is proving a bit elusive to get hold of an actual physical copy of, because it's the novel Ue by Becky Manawatu, who is a New Zealand writer, and I think this was published in New Zealand quite a while ago and has won a couple of awards in New Zealand, but it hasn't physically been published in the UK yet. And so when I went into Daunt Books and wanted to buy a copy of it, they said it's not actually being published until August of this year. But then when I looked online, it was published in Kindle form back in March this year. So so I can read it that way, but I'm gonna have to wait a while to actually get a copy of it. But yeah, it sounds really good. So it follows the story of a number of different Maori children who have lost their parents or been separated from their parents, and it follows their stories over time. But also, one narrative strand is by their deceased mother telling her story. So yeah, it sounds like a really fascinating tale of family that's been separated from each other. But yeah, I'm just gonna have to wait to actually get a copy of it. And this quote from a Guardian review makes it sound so enticing. So it says, "The plot reveals are masterful. Ue has done well because it is expertly crafted, but also because it has something indefinable, enthralling, puzzling, gripping, and familiar, yet otherworldly," which makes it sound so enticing. So those are all the books on this BBC Culture list of the best books of the year so far. I'd love to know in the comments if you've read any of these books and if you agree with their choices, or if you have other books that you think are the best books that have been published this year so far, or maybe backlisted titles that you've read for the first time that you absolutely loved. Please let me know about that in the comments below. But I'm looking forward to reading some more of these books, and then hopefully soon coming up with my own best books of the year list so far. So I'll speak to you again soon, and I hope you're reading good things, and have a good day. Bye bye.